Boston's top-flight medical schools are discovering the basic building blocks of life. Pfizer is a pharmaceutical giant looking to invigorate its drug pipeline. So, Boston meet Pfizer, Pfizer meet Boston. It was all smiles last week as Governor Deval Patrick and Boston Mayor Tom Menino helped Pfizer unveil its new Center for Therapeutic Innovation. Located in the Longwood neighborhood, the new center hopes to sponsor promising research being done at nearby medical schools. Pfizer will spend $100 million in the hopes that the collaboration will lead to the development of new drugs faster than if Pfizer developed them alone. Whether this broad new collaboration between business and academia will pay off is still an open question. And here to discuss this is Allyn Bass. She is a science reporter and an author. And Allison, thanks for coming in tonight. This seems like it would be a win-win. $100 million, the governor's on board, the mayor's on board. Good for, pharma and good for Boston?
Well, I definitely think it's good for Big Pharma, whether or not, and it's certainly good in terms of if there are jobs, so it may bring some jobs. But there is a downside to this, and I think we have to look at that. I mean, I've written, and other people like Dr. Marcia Angel, a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and a professor at Harvard Medical School, has written about the conflicts of interest in medicine and what happens when academic medicine evolves into big business and has too close a collusion or relationship with pharmaceutical industry, and the fact that instead of doing cutting-edge research that might truly benefit the American public into, say, vaccines or orphan drugs, with a partnership like this, with Pfizer, they may put their best and brightest and most of their resources into developing commercially profitable drugs, Me Too kinds of drugs.
So the mass appeal drugs, the things that would apply to the most people versus, things that would only apply to a certain small segment of the population. Well, how do they get funding then if they can't take it from pharmaceuticals? We understand the conflict of interest, but everybody's cut back so much. Even Pfizer themselves have cut back. How do researchers fund, and what is it, $1 billion before you can get a drug to the market?
Well, actually, most basic research is funded by the federal government, by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. And what's interesting here is that often leads to a lot of early breakthroughs in potential drug development, and that's taxpayer-funded money. So I would argue that that type of research should accrue back to the American public. In other words, so instead of going into the pockets of Pfizer and other big pharmaceutical companies who then, develop these drugs, go through clinical trials and charge an exorbitant amount, particularly to the American public, I would argue that the taxpayers should get the benefit of this type of research that's being done at academic centers. What happens with partnerships like this is that Pfizer has ultimate control over what types of drugs are developed. And again, what you might see are the type of Me Too drugs that might, as you say, have be most commercially profitable and have mass appeal, kind of things like the atypical antipsychotics, which have been way overprescribed in children, antidepressants, which again have been overprescribed in children and don't show efficacy in children and adolescents. That was the subject of my book, Side Effects, which talks about, the fact that the pharmaceutical industry didn't tell consumers and doctors the full story of the safety and effectiveness of these drugs.
And we do want to make mention that we invited Pfizer to be here with us this evening, but they declined our invitation. We do want to know, you talked about the money and who shares in the profits. Is there some kind of an arrangement where, the researcher would be able to profit, society in general be able to profit, and obviously these companies that put up the money should make some profit, but is it too much?
Well, I think one of the things that Dr. Marcia Angel has been calling for, among many other ethicists, is that the drug companies can put money into a large sum, which is then given to the NIH, and the NIH can control the drug trials so that they are done by independent researchers. See, what happens is when drug companies actually fund the clinical trials, At the same time that they give millions of dollars to fund these studies, they're also giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to the same researchers on the side in consulting and speaking gigs.
Yes.
And that tends to skew their findings. In other words, there's research that shows that doctors who get this money on the side are more likely to issue positive findings than those who don't.
We have seen an attempt by the industry to sort of police that, by academia to sort of police that. Harvard has, put some constraints on their doctors as to, how much money they can make from a pharmaceutical company. Is that a good step? Has it been productive, or are they finding other ways around it?
I think they're finding other ways around it. The new guidelines by Harvard Medical School, again, Dr. Marcia Angel took a look at them recently and said that there are still many ways in which the pharmaceutical industry can get money to doctors and influence their judgment, not only in terms of prescribing, but in their research. And the problem with this Pfizer partnership with Boston area medical schools is that these medical schools are the ones who need to police the conflicts of interest on the part of their own faculty. But if they're getting money from the same companies, how can they have their own conflicts of interest? So it makes it even more difficult to police these kind of conflicts. And the conflicts really do bias the empirical scientific research that comes out. As I showed in my book, it makes it much more likely for researchers to come up with positive findings and skew the medical data in favor of a drug. But even beyond that, I think it may take researchers away from really important cancer drugs and other types of drugs which may not have the blockbuster appeal of some of the, Me Too types of psychoactive drugs, because those are the ones that can be made, the market share can be enormous, and those are the ones that make the big profits. And we should be funding, having an independent source of funding that looks into what really will be innovative and creative in terms of new kinds of genetic drugs.
That's why we have medical journalists like you to keep tabs on it. All right, thanks so much, Allison Bass, for joining us here this evening.
My pleasure, thank you.
And that's it for Greater Boston.